Good day. Over the last 24 hours, there's been a flurry of reports in the Western media to the effect that Bakhmut, this town in Donetsk region, which has been at the center of the fighting in the Ukraine conflict since August, that Bakhmut is about to fall. Now, I'm going to read a few of these reports. The first I'm going to read is from The Guardian, and it was published yesterday, 18 hours ago, from the time of the making of this video, and it is by Daniel Bolfi. And it says, Ukraine struggling to hold Bakhmut, military sources say. On Saturday, Ukraine's armed forces reported that Russia had turned its artillery fire on 40 settlements close to Bakhmut, the city in the eastern Donetsk region that has been at the heart of some of the most intense fighting in recent months. Military sources said Ukrainian forces were now struggling to hold the city after the Ukrainian army's withdrawal from the nearby city of Soledar last week. Well, in fact, the Ukrainians didn't withdraw from Soledar last week. They withdraw from Soledar at least 2 weeks ago, but let's pass that. The Russians are destroying anything that can be used for cover, said one source. The Ukrainian forces don't have enough artillery. I'm going to come back to the topic of artillery later in this program. And then the report goes on to say, the risk of Bakhmut being encircled was said to be growing, with Ukraine's army facing shortages of artillery that could hold back the advancing Russian forces. So what this article is saying is that Ukrainian defenses around Bakhmut are cracking, and that Ukraine is short of artillery, and that the Russians are steadily closing in on Bakhmut, that they're coming very close to encircling the place. Now, if you've been following this program, this channel, you will know that I've been reporting that for several days now. But anyway, yesterday, The Guardian finally caught up with this. And there's also been another report, this time from Zero Hedge, and it says this. Currently, Russia is escalating attacks in and around the strategic Donetsk region city of Bakhmut, with international and Western reports acknowledging that Russian forces have the battlefield momentum and upper hand at this point. The Wall Street Journal reports Saturday that inside Bakhmut, gunshots echoed from the east side of the river that bisects the city. Waves of Russian troops were pushing in from the east, and two pontoon bridges across the river hit this week were passable only by foot, Ukrainian soldiers said. Ukrainians said they were fighting for each block, but were outnumbered and outgunned, and the Russians were slowly taking territory in the city, the report adds. Some war monitors have said the Russians have the city almost encircled at this juncture. So this is about Bakhmut itself. There's a link to an article in the Wall Street Journal. I don't subscribe, as I've said, to the Wall Street Journal, so I can't read the article itself, but it's clear that it is now reporting that there's street fighting going on inside Bakhmut itself. Again, if you've been following this channel, you will have known that this was the case for some time. But anyway, that there is street fighting going on within Bakhmut, that the town is on the point of being encircled, or at least is being gradually encircled, and that the Ukrainians there feel themselves to be outnumbered and outgunned. Whether they're actually outnumbered is a moot point, but they are certainly outgunned, and that, of course, is what that report in The Guardian also said, that the Russians have an overwhelming preponderance of artillery power. And lastly, I would say that the Zero Hedge report took us to an article on a site called Unheard, which, to be honest, I don't know, and written by a gentleman, Mr. Lucas Weber, whom, again, I'm be straightforward about this, I don't know him. But anyway, he also provides these reports about the fighting in Bakhmut, and this was again written on Thursday. This is the day before. This is some days ago. Ukraine is on the verge of losing Bakhmut. Western sources are now advising Kiev to strategically withdraw. Well, again, this is something I've been talking about for some time. Some days ago, about a week ago, we had a report from Reuters which confirmed that a US official, a US military official, was briefing the media that the US was advising the Ukrainians to pull back from Bakhmut, something which, by the way, as we've seen, the Ukrainians for the moment are not doing. And then the article, this is by Mr. Weber, goes on to say the battle for Bakhmut has been long and arduous, with both sides suffering a heavy human toll. Throughout this period, Russian forces, spearheaded by the Wagner organization, have made incremental gains, but since the fall of Soledar, they have been moving much faster. Now, Ukraine's position in and around the city is rapidly deteriorating as Russia seeks to encircle the strategically important town. The Americans are believed to be advising Kiev to withdraw from the city to preserve troops and equipment. So, a whole flurry of articles from the Western media about the imminent fall of Bakhmut. None of this is going to be news to anybody who's been following events in Ukraine on this channel, that Bakhmut is on the brink of being encircled, or at least the Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut are on the brink of being encircled, that those Ukrainian troops are heavily outgunned by the Russian military, that the United States is advising Ukraine to pull its troops out of Bakhmut, something which, by the way, even as of the time of making of this video, Ukraine shows absolutely no sign of doing. Well, that's something, as I said, we've been saying on this video, on this program for a long time. We've been discussing it, Alex Christoforou and I, on the Duran. But finally, we see the Western media coming round and acknowledging that all of this is indeed the case. Now, why suddenly has this happened? Why is the Western media, which until a few days ago was still reporting that Ukraine was holding its own in Bakhmut, why is it suddenly now reporting that the situation in Bakhmut is becoming critical? Well, one reason could be that yesterday, that's to say on Saturday, we got reports that the Russians had captured near Bakhmut a village rather, called Blagodatnoye. This is another village. It's a small, well, this is the TASS report, by the way, which perhaps sums up the situation, and I'm just going to read it. The Blagodatnoye settlement near Soledar in the Donetsk People's Republic has come under control of Russia's forces, Yevgeny Prigozhin, founder of the Wagner private military company, said on Sunday. The units of the Wagner private military company took Blagodatnoye. Blagodatnoye is under our control, his press service quoted him as saying on its Telegram channel. The commentary is accompanied by an audio recording of remarks by a commander of an assault unit that reached the southern outskirts of Blagodatnoye. And in fact, I've seen a photograph of what appear to be Wagner assault troops in Blagodatnoye. They're holding up their hands with their rifles in them, and they look like they are celebrating some kind of a victory, presumably the capture of this settlement. Now, Blagodatnoye is not one of the villages that I've mentioned in the recent past, in recent programs. It's located somewhere to the north of these other villages, Krasnaya Gora, Paraskovievke. I think I've got this correct. And by the way, let me take this opportunity to thank that kind person who sent me emails explaining the correct pronunciation both of that village and of other villages and settlements in and around Bakhmut, and explaining also what the names of these villages and settlements mean. It turns out that Paraskovievke is connected with Paraskevi, which is Greek for Friday. Well, Good Friday, perhaps. Anyway, let's not get distracted by discussions of that kind. But anyway, it's, as I said, Blagodatnoye is located north of these places, is located north of Krasnaya Gora, and indeed of Solidar itself. And it's close, as far as I can see, to a water barrier, a river or canal of some kind. And it also seems to be close to some of the main roads, and one of those roads heading towards the north. And I've seen an analysis of this, the importance of this capture of this particular place. It says that it provides the Russians with further opportunities to cut the roads heading into Bakhmut. It causes the Ukrainian positions in Krasnaya Gora and Paraskovievke to become increasingly precarious. The Ukrainians face encirclement if they stay in these two settlements, and it also strengthens the Russian advance north towards Seversk, this town at the northern spoke of the Zelensky line, the current Ukrainian defense line in Donbass. So if all of these places are captured, then of course, which it now looks likely that they will be, and the capture of Blagodatnoye brings forward that moment, then it does look as if the situation in and around Bakhmut is now getting ever closer to that point where the Ukrainians become, any Ukrainians still in the town, Bakhmut, become trapped there and will find it extremely difficult to leave. So this is apparently an important development, and I suspect it's one of the things that may have been the contributing factor to these particular, this new flurry of headlines that we're suddenly seeing in the Western media, catching up with the fact that the situation of the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut is deteriorating. I would say that I suspect another factor is unrelated to actual events on the battlefield. It is almost certainly connected to the recent admission from Ukraine that it has lost control of Solidar, that Solidar has itself been captured by the Russians. As I said, we know that the Russians actually captured Solidar in the middle of January, but Ukraine refused to acknowledge this, or failed to acknowledge this, for around 2 weeks. A couple of days ago, timing that confirmation with the announcement of the tank deliveries from the West, Ukraine finally acknowledged that Solidar was indeed under Russian control, and the result has been a scramble on the part of Western media and Ukrainian officials to try to bring the situation, news about the situation in and around Bakhmut, up to date. Now, before I leave this topic of the fighting around Bakhmut, I should say that I've been taking a further look at the maps, to the extent, as I said, that I'm able to read maps. Very difficult for me to do, given my eyesight problems and my difficulties anyway, conceptually understanding maps. But it does seem to me that the Russians seem to be pushing what look to be quite wide pincers. So, as I said, Blagodatnoye is to the north of some of the other places like Krasnaya Gora and Paraskovievke, and indeed Soledar, that I've been discussing in recent programs. And we also see what is starting to look like a Russian advance towards Chasov Yar, which is a small town, apparently not an easy town to defend, somewhere to the west of Bakhmut itself. And as I said, this is a rather wider pincer movement than might have been expected, perhaps by an inexpert person like myself. Conceivably, the Russians are indeed now working towards doing that which I have wondered whether they might do, whether their plan is not just to capture Bakhmut itself with all its important communications and transport links and all that, and not to capture or destroy the 2 brigades of Ukrainian troops that are defending Bakhmut, but whether the plan might be to encircle and destroy the entire Ukrainian Bakhmut group, the large number of troops that Ukraine has positioned close to Bakhmut in an attempt to support the defense of the place. Now, that is purely my speculation. I may be completely wrong about that, but just I throw it out. As I said, it does look like a rather wide pincer movement. It's clearly a pincer movement of some kind. It may be that topographical and other factors are in play, which I don't fully know about or understand, but so far what I'm seeing would be consistent with a possible plan to, as I said, carry out a wider encirclement that doesn't take in just Bakhmut itself and the troops located inside the town, but also might be intended to take in some of the troops, the large concentrations of Ukrainian troops which are positioned near the town. Anyway, that's Bakhmut. And there's also been news from another area of the front lines, which is Vuhledar. Now, it's been difficult to get very much information about Vuhledar, but it now seems that one of the reasons that the front lines remained stopped, I mean, the Russians made an advance, but then, as I said, that advance seemed to stop, seemed to hit some kind of pause button. One of the reasons, the reason in fact, is that the Ukrainians tried to launch a counterattack to drive the Russians back. Now, this is a regular occurrence over the course of this fighting. Whenever the Russians take territory, the response of the Ukrainians after they've lost that territory is to try to recapture it. Just a few weeks ago, after Soledar fell, there was reports. There weren't just reports; they were reports of an actual events. The Ukrainians did launch a series of counterattacks trying to recapture Soledar. These counterattacks seemed to me at the time to be hopeless, throwing away more precious lives and equipment, but that was what the Ukrainians were doing in Soledar. They've done it in other places. I can remember that during the fighting in Severodonetsk, for example, back in the summer, the Ukrainians announced that they'd carried out some kind of counterattack within Severodonetsk itself, and there were reports to that effect in the Western media. And it looks as if they've launched some sort of further counterattack in Vuhledar. Nearly all of these counterattacks that I've heard about over the course of this fighting, which Ukraine launches, fail, and the one in Vuhledar appears to have been no exception. Apparently, according to Russian reports, the Ukrainians were driven back with some losses, and that seems likely because in its latest summary of the state of the fighting, the Ukrainian General Staff has admitted that a settlement near Vuhledar has been captured by the Russians, which seems consistent with the failure of this counterattack. Though, as always, the Ukrainians do give different accounts of the state of the battlefields from the Russians. For example, they continue to insist that Pavlovka, this village, this big village near Vuhledar, which the Russians claim they captured last year, that is still contested, even though the Russians insist that they fully control it. And again, on this issue, I tend to prefer what the Russians think. So we see clear evidence of a significant deterioration in Ukrainian positions in Donbass. Their attempt to drive the Russians back in Vuhledar has failed, and even they now are admitting that there's been a significant deterioration of their position in Bakhmut, and the Russians are claiming that this settlement of Blagodatnoye has fallen. We're not quite at the end of the fighting for Bakhmut, but it is getting ever closer. And as I think the United States is increasingly thinking, the longer the Ukrainians try to defend their positions in Bakhmut, the more dangerous it becomes for them. The more troops they lose, the more equipment they lose, and they risk an encirclement, not just of the troops in Bakhmut itself, but as I said, of their larger grouping, which could be extremely, extremely bad news for them. And note that all of these reports in The Guardian, in Zero Hedge, by Mr. Weber, all of them starting to use now, and I think for the first time, the word encirclement to describe the situation in Bakhmut. So that's, it seems to me, the most important news on the battlefronts. There's been further fighting on the Svatovo-Kremenaya front. The Ukrainians have been trying to launch more attacks there. The Russians claim all those attacks have been repelled. I think these reports of Ukrainian attacks are true, and I also think that the Russian claims that these attacks have been repelled are true also. So the pattern, ever since the effective end of the Kharkiv counteroffensive, Ukraine's Kharkiv counteroffensive back in October, the story here in this area of the battlefronts on the border between Kharkiv region and Lugansk region in northern Donbass, in other words, is of the Ukrainians bashing their heads against a wall. And it seems that that is what they're continuing to do. They're continuing to launch attacks towards either Svatovo or Kremenaya. In every instance, they come up against overwhelming Russian artillery concentrations. They're forced to pull back. They suffer losses. They reinforce, reorganize, launch further attacks, and the whole process repeats itself and has been doing so for more times now than I can count. And for their part, the Russians also seem to be pushing, though more incrementally and more carefully in this same area. There are reports that they've been pushing again now towards Kupiansk, this town on the Oskol River that they abandoned over the course of the Kharkiv counteroffensive back in the autumn, but it's clear that they're not yet thinking of an actual assault to recapture Kupiansk itself. One could say that it's a stalemate along the Svatovo-Kremenaya line, and that would presumably be true, But it's a costly stalemate, costly especially for Ukraine, which, as I said, is engaging in these counterattacks, or rather these attacks towards Svatov and Kremenaya, all of which get pushed back. Anyway, I think that's a fair summary of the situation on the battlefronts. Obviously, it's a dynamically evolving situation in and around Bakhmut. We'll see how much longer it takes before the situation in that area, in Bakhmut itself, comes to a conclusion. But for the moment, as I said, it's clear that the Russians have the momentum. They're advancing in Bakhmut. They're advancing in Vuhledar. A Russian commander, actually he's a Chechen commander attached to the Lugansk militia, claimed about 2 days ago that he expected to see the Russians in full control of Donbass, all of Donbass, by March. Well, there have been various predictions about times when Donbass would fall fully under Russian control. I can remember a Russian official back in August suggesting that the entirety of Donbass would be under Russian control by the end of August, and obviously that didn't turn out. So maybe we should take these predictions of the Russian capture of the entirety of Donbass, of Donetsk and Lugansk region with some skepticism, but clearly the Russians have the momentum, and it does seem as if Ukrainian lines are cracking. So that's where we are with the situation in on the battlefronts. Now, there's been some very interesting revelations on the industrial military side of the war, and it is to those that I now wish to come. Now, if you remember, about a week ago, there was a report from Reuters which said that the United States was advising, and this is all based upon actual briefings by a senior US official, so it was quite authoritative, that the United States was advising Ukraine to engage in no further counteroffensives for the present time, that it should concentrate on first receiving and then training and achieving skill in operating the various armored units, the armored equipment that it's due to receive over the next few weeks, perhaps months, the Leopard 2 tanks, the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, the Marder infantry fighting vehicles, and that it should first bring itself up to a certain level of competence in operating these machines. Daniel Davis, by the way, Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, has said that the earliest date at which Ukraine would be able to use this equipment with any degree of real competence would be sometime in the autumn. So we're not talking about spring or summer offensives. Well, I'm not an expert on these matters. But anyway, that the Ukrainians should not launch any counteroffensives of that nature at the moment. And this report on Reuters also effectively conceded that the United States would not be able to match Russian artillery volumes, and that Ukraine should not try to match Russia shell for shell, and should try to avoid getting drawn into an attrition war of the sort that it is currently fighting, because if it did, it would lose the war. Well, that was all very interesting, but the major revelation was about artillery volumes. The fact that the United States has, in all essentials, now given up on the idea that it can supply Ukraine with enough artillery to match the volumes of artillery that the Russians are firing on any particular day over the course of this war. And by the way, it seems that the United States has most probably also finally accepted that the Russians are not going to run out of shells. This has been a story that has been running in the media in the West for some months, but the fact that they're advising Ukraine not to try to match Russian artillery shelling, not to try to match the Russians shell for shell. Of course, the Ukrainians have never been able to do that. Well, that also seems to show that the United States no longer believes that Russia is about to run out of shells. Well, that was interesting in itself, but we've now had a very interesting report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is an American agency that basically think tank that looks at all kinds of things, including military matters. And its basic theme is that the United States needs to start rethinking its military architecture, because what we're seeing is a return to industrial war, that volumes do matter, that the United States cannot match the volumes of its adversaries, China and Russia, that if it found itself in a shooting war with the Chinese, it would run out of missiles in about a week, and whereas the Chinese and the Russians seem to have an unlimited amount of missiles and artillery and all those sort of things with which to maintain the war, and that the United States therefore needs to rebuild its military industrial base and its entire structure of its military economy in order to be able to match the Chinese and the Russians in industrial war. Now, again, you've heard all of this on this channel, and I don't pretend to any great authority here. The authorities are, respectively, Brian Beletic at the New Atlas, and also perhaps Lieutenant Colonel, mostly Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vershinin, who has been writing a whole series of articles, very interesting articles, talking about the return of industrial war. In fact, to my knowledge, it was Lieutenant Colonel Vershinin who first came up with the concept of industrial war, that war, despite all that we've been hearing about, high-tech weapons and all those things over the last 30 years or so, precision-guided munitions and all that, that war ultimately continues to be industrial, that you can't replace volumes with high-precision tools, that volumes ultimately remain decisive in battle, especially when that battle is waged between peer opponents, but such as the United States, the Russians, and the Chinese. I may as well say that, as far as I'm concerned, the CSIS report, this long report, it's 44 pages long. It's a 44-page report which essentially says what Lieutenant Colonel Vershinin has been saying in articles which are perhaps 2 or 3 pages long. It's just, so far as I can see, an extended version of the reports, or rather the articles, written by Lieutenant Colonel Vershinin. Anyway, I'm not going to go into the details of this, nor am I going to discuss the aspects of this war that might involve conflict with China. In respect to Ukraine, I'm just going to read this section of the report, which to my mind is the most important section. This is what it says. One of the most lethal weapons the United States has sent to Ukraine are 155mm howitzers these are the M777 howitzers, that fire high explosive ammunition weighing about 100 pounds each and are able to hit targets nearly 20 miles away. As of January 2023, the United States military has provided Ukraine with up to 1,074,000 rounds of 155mm ammunition, significantly shrinking the availability of 155mm rounds in storage. Because of the limited availability of 155mm howitzers and ammunition, the United States began sending 105mm howitzers and ammunition instead. And that's absolutely true. That is exactly what has been happening. The United States has plundered all of its stocks of 155mm ammunition. It's also starting to plunder the stocks of its allies. There's been reports that it's taking stocks of 155mm ammunition from South Korea. It took 300,000 155mm shells from the joint reserve that Israel and the United States have created in Israel itself to cover needs in the case of a conflict in the Middle East. It's now pressing Germany, Rheinmetall, to resume production of 155mm shells. Rheinmetall, by the way, says that they can do so. They're talking about increasing their production, but of course it would be nothing like to the levels of what the Russians are able to produce. So we have this situation of the United States finding that it is facing itself a 155mm shell shortage. And I've also read reports, I can't confirm these, but they do seem to be reasonably plausible, that only a quarter of the M777 howitzers that were supplied to the United States by the United States to Ukraine are still functioning on the battlefields. Right at the start, when the question of supplying Ukraine with these howitzers was first mooted, I can remember Scott Ritter pointing out that there would be severe problems operating these howitzers in Ukraine, that they were high-tech, rather delicate howitzers, that perhaps they did have superior accuracy and range than some of the Russian guns, though I have to be frank, I'm increasingly having doubts about that too, but that they were too fragile for operation in Ukraine, and anyway, over and on top of that, the Russians would quickly be able to destroy most of them. And it seems to me that Scott Ritter was absolutely right. The Ukrainians themselves, there have been lots of reports about this from Ukraine, that they've been grumbling about how fragile these howitzers are, how they constantly break down, how they cannot be used to sustain high volumes of shelling, such as this war calls for. And also the Russians have been claiming that they've been able to destroy many of these howitzers, and in fact that is indeed precisely what has been happening. All the reports about the destruction of these howitzers appears to be true. And the Russians haven't just been knocking out these howitzers, these M777 howitzers, they've also, from what I can see, been fairly successful knocking out the various self-propelled howitzers that the other Western powers have been delivering. There's been lots of pictures of M109 howitzers from NATO being destroyed, lots of the Crab howitzers supplied by Poland, some of which, by the way, at least according to some reports, are operated by Polish crews. Apparently of the 20 that were delivered, around 10 may have been destroyed already in the fighting. And generally speaking, it's clear that the Western powers simply cannot continue to supply either shells or artillery to Ukraine on anything like the scale that would be needed to match Russian artillery volumes. And I would just add that Ukraine is also clearly now running into problems with its old Soviet artillery. Much of that has also been destroyed, but I saw a report a day or so ago that Ukraine is now using World War II ammunition for some of its 203 millimeter Soviet-era self-propelled guns, and it's been suggested that this is an indication that Ukraine has run out of modern shells, more up-to-date shells for these guns, and that stocks of ammunition for these Soviet-era guns are starting to run out. Now, there's also, by the way, been an awful lot of reports recently about the Russians being increasingly successful in their counter-battery work, their ability to destroy Ukrainian artillery. There's been a lot of talk about a piece of Russian equipment called the penicillin, which apparently has been recently delivered to the Russian troops. This is a device for locating guns which have fired on Russian troops. It's a sort of artillery location system. It doesn't work on radar principles. It works, as far as I can judge, on acoustic principles, which means, by the way, that it's passive. Radars emit signals which the other side can track. An acoustic system presumably doesn't. But anyway, I'm not going to get into the details of this. I don't pretend to have much knowledge in this area, or indeed any knowledge in this area, but it does seem as if the Russians have indeed been more and more successful, destroying more and more Ukrainian guns of every conceivable description, and perhaps equally importantly, that they've been increasingly successful destroying Ukrainian artillery radars, including American-supplied artillery radars. There's even been some suggestions, which I have seen, that the United States is running out of radars, artillery radars, to sell to Ukraine. And I'm going to suggest that this is, in fact, what lies behind all of this sudden shift in weapons supplies to Ukraine. The United States has come to understand that it cannot win this artillery war with Russia. The CSIS report admits that for the moment, the United States is not able to produce the number of shells that would be needed to match Russian artillery volumes, nor can they produce the number of guns that would be needed to match Russian artillery volumes. The CSIS report does talk about the fact that the United States does still have large stocks of 105 millimeter ammunition and 105 millimeter guns, and these are certainly better than nothing, but it's become absolutely clear, to me at least, that it is the heavy shells, the 155 millimeter shells on the Ukrainian and Western side, the 152 millimeter and 203 millimeter shells on the Russian side that are decisive in this war. So, the United States has come to understand that it cannot match the Russians in this type of equipment. So what is it going to do? Well, again, we go back to that Reuters report. They've decided to try to adjust by providing Ukraine with armored vehicles instead. Thus, the delivery of the 109 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, the 40 Marder infantry fighting vehicles from Germany, the 90 Striker wheeled vehicles from the United States, the AMR-10 wheeled tanks from France, the 14 Challenger 2 tanks from Britain, and the 88 Leopard 2 tanks that are said to be arriving, well, 14 from Germany, the remainder from various other NATO countries. So we're moving, we've given up hope of countering this Russian artillery. We can't match Russia's artillery. We're therefore going to provide armor instead. Now, the problem with that is, and this has been something which I've been reading quite a lot about, the problem with that is that armor by itself is extremely vulnerable to artillery and to fortifications. And of course, the Russians have built lots of those. And of course, if it has to operate in an environment where the other side has air superiority, it's vulnerable in that respect as well. And this, of course, I'm not even going to address the enormous logistical and training issues, which I've discussed extensively in previous programs. But I've been thinking about what this means, because presumably there are people in the United States and in Germany and elsewhere who understand all of this. And I wonder whether this is where all this discussion about the F-16s is coming from. Because if these tanks and armored vehicles are going to be effective on the battlefields, well, they will presumably need some degree of air support. And Ukraine's Air Force, as we can tell from the condition it's in, from the various war reports, is in no real position any longer to provide it. So the tanks and the armored vehicles only make sense if the F-16 fighter jets are provided as well. And we're seeing more and more rumors now that the question of providing the F-16 fighter jets is on the agenda, that it's being talked about. There was a report in Politico that there's a group of people in the Pentagon who are pressing for delivery of these things. I should say that it didn't look to me like a very convincing report. It was based on one particular, a report from one particular defense official who didn't seem to be saying that this is indeed what was actually going to happen, and two other people who were not Defense Department officials, but who were claimed to have some knowledge of what was going on within the Pentagon. But anyway, there does seem to be some insistence now that F-16s should be provided to Ukraine, because ultimately without them, how is this armor going to work? How is it going to achieve its purpose? Now, there have been any number of reports from any number of people pointing out, firstly, what a huge escalation supplying F-16s would be, and also the almost insuperable problems in operating them. The infrastructure to operate F-16s in Ukraine does not exist. And of course, the airfields anyway, that infrastructure is under daily attack, or potentially daily attack, from the Russians. The idea of operating F-16s from Poland is theoretically possible, but it would be incredibly dangerous. It would be an incredibly dangerous act of escalation. And of course, over and above and beyond that, there is the issue that Ukraine doesn't have pilots in anything like the number able to operate F-16s. Apparently training has already been underway for some time, but it takes apparently at least a year to train a Ukrainian pilot to the level of competence that they can fly F-16s. And anyway, it would be an incredibly difficult thing to do. But we can see that there are some people who are doing it. They've managed to get these armored vehicles to Ukraine, not in huge numbers, and they're now pressing to send the F-16s, perhaps because they recognize that the one without the other is a conceptually disastrously flawed idea. It cannot work given the enormous Russian superiority in artillery. You need air support to make it possible for these tanks to do their thing, and that's why the F-16s are being supplied, or there's talk about having these F-16s supplied. Now, I have seen other suggestions that, in fact, before the United States starts delivering F-16s, long-range drones could be sent instead. And it's been rumoured that the United States is pressing Italy to provide its long-range drones, which are in store. They're quite elderly. They're not really perhaps fit for use in the battlefields. I doubt that that is enough. The Russian air defense system has shown great facility in shooting down drones. I suspect it will have great facility shooting down F-16s as well, by the way. But my own personal view is that in this escalatory escalator that the West has trapped itself into, well, it won't just be drones. At some point, probably sometime in the late spring or early summer, there'll be an announcement that the F-16s are on their way as well. And I'm going to make a guess that the intention is to have all of these F-16s ready and the tanks and the infantry fighting vehicles and all those ready sometime by the autumn to launch that offensive then. I doubt realistically that there's any hope now of any kind of offensive in the spring. Now, all of this seems to me to be extraordinarily dangerous, to put it mildly. Again, one does wonder how the Russians are going to respond. But in the meantime, as I said, the momentum to do this is building, and I don't personally think it can be stopped, at least not for the moment. But I suspect that all of these signals that we're getting from the Pentagon, I discussed the RAND report in my program yesterday. There's been this new report from the CSIS, which is saying that the United States is dangerously depleting its stocks. It's going to be very vulnerable in the event of a war with China because it's running down key stocks of weapons at exceptionally fast levels. Well, it's perhaps becoming understandable why there are some people in the military, in the United States, in the Pentagon, who are becoming increasingly concerned. We saw about a week ago that various Navy officials were talking about this. They were saying that in 6 months' time, the United States would be at a fork in the road. Either it continued to support Ukraine, or it prioritized defense against China. Realistically, it could not do both. So that, I think, is the background to that report from the RAND Corporation that I discussed yesterday. And we've seen how the CSIS report, in a way, fleshes out the details. And it's not just the Russians who are becoming worried, or the Americans rather, who are becoming worried, because we're now getting reports from Germany as well. Firstly, there's been a very interesting report in The Economist, which says that the state of the German army is deteriorating. It is deplorable, apparently, according to The Economist. The weapon systems that Germany is sending to Ukraine are weakening the German army, the German military, further. Instead of Germany sorting out the problems of its military, building up its own equipment base, restocking its ammunition, acquiring more tanks, acquiring more artillery, what it is doing instead is it's sending its stocks of vehicles, many of them not in particularly good condition. Anyway, it's sending them and other weapon systems to Ukraine, where of course they will be lost irretrievably with Germany in terms of its defense spending, its defense commitments, in effect trying to run in order to stand still, struggling both to keep Ukraine armed and equipped and at the same time rebuild its own military. And in effect, that's precisely the point the generals Kuyat and Fard and other German military officers have been making, that this is a completely ill-conceived plan. Sending all this equipment to Ukraine is actually weakening Germany's defense posture. And we're getting the same reports now from one military across NATO after another. Germany is saying this. The French military apparently saying this. The British military are very unhappy about the delivery of the 14 Challenger 2 tanks. There's reports circulating today that they're worried that some of these tanks might fall into Russian hands, compromising their secret armor and equipment, and that there's all sorts of elaborate and overcomplicated and probably unachievable ideas about how to rescue and pull back one of these tanks if it's knocked out in the battle and risks being captured by the Russians. Fantastic ideas, in my opinion, given that we're talking about 80 to 90 ton vehicles. But I mean, how does one pull a thing like that back in a hurry under fire? I really don't know. But anyway, I'm not going to go there. So you can see that the militaries are unhappy. But there are also reports from Germany, and I read these in the Daily Telegraph, that one person in particular in Germany is now privately furious with what has happened, and that is Olaf Scholz. And this is, of course, entirely from the Daily Telegraph, which is no fan of Olaf Scholz, and I don't know how accurate it is, how real it is, but apparently Scholz is livid with the pressure that he was placed under to authorize the Leopard 2 tank deliveries to Ukraine. He didn't want to do it. He thinks it's ill-advised and misconceived. He is aware of the concerns of the German military. He's aware of how Germany's military defenses are deteriorating. And he also is concerned about escalation, the possibilities, the dangers of escalation with the Russians. So all of that is coming now from Olaf Scholz, or rather, apparently Olaf Scholz is very angry. And the reports suggest that he's also very, very angry with some members of his own government and what he feels are the excessively belligerent statements that they are making. And it's not difficult to guess who he has in mind. People like Foreign Minister Baerbock, Vice Chancellor Habeck, and the others. And it shows to me the trap that he's walked into. It shows the trap that all Western governments have walked into. Because what they're doing is they're not just depleting their own stocks as they face a critical equipment and ammunition shortage, which is actually weakening their underlying defense positions. That's what RAND, the CSIS, Alex Vershinin, the German government, the German military, all of these people are now saying that ammunition stocks are running down and are becoming exhausted. The West is weakening in its overall defense positions. But they're being propelled forward into taking extremely grave risks, providing armored equipment to Ukraine, something which they said they would never do. And that is pushing them to provide air cover for those armored vehicles in its wake. And that's something they never wanted to do either. Now, there's been a whole flurry of comments recently from NATO officials insisting that there will be no direct intervention by NATO in the fighting in Ukraine. And I can't help but think that what this is all about is American and European officials who are becoming worried about this, again reiterating that NATO personnel, that is to say, American, British, German personnel, will not operate fighter jets over Ukraine. They will not be directly engaged in the fighting. They do not want their own aircraft going into the battlefronts, facing the Russian air defense system, getting shot down. They do not want to be in a direct battle with the Russians. So, what it comes down to, therefore, is a plan to put together some kind of armoured strike force. And given the problems with supplies in Europe, I'm going to say this. I think that people who think that the Europeans are going to be able to provide more armour and artillery and infantry fighting vehicles over and above those which have been provided are probably wrong. And I think the Pentagon, worried about possible conflicts in China, and a US military official has talked about the possibility of a war with China by 2025. They will be unwilling to supply more of their equipment also. And I think they understand perfectly well that none of this makes any kind of sense. Ukraine is not going to have the time to really get on top of the enormous challenges of operating this equipment. And the idea of Ukraine operating fighter jets, which is the only way of making this equipment work, well, that's really a fanciful and incredibly dangerous idea, and one which could turn out very badly. I would quickly add that in every war that's been fought since the Second World War, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, there's always this comment made after the war has been lost that the United States tries to remodel the army that it is supporting, South Vietnamese, the Afghan, the Iraqi, whatever, after its own image. It's trying to get these armies to operate with American equipment as the American military does. And this has never worked. American equipment is intended for American use, and trying to transplant the American way of war into that of other countries has always been a consistent failure. And yet, perforce, that is what is being done in Ukraine again. Now, given all of this, one can perhaps understand why there are people like General Milley, like indeed Olaf Scholz, who apparently are now once again talking about the need for some kind of peace talks. And interestingly enough, Scholz today has reiterated that he's going to maintain direct contact with Putin, that he still wants to go on speaking to Putin, and one wonders why. So, we are in a trap. We, by that I mean the West, of which, let me repeat again, I am a part. I'm a citizen of two Western countries, Greece and Britain, and I am as much in that respect tied into this as everybody else in the West is we are trapped. We are escalating in a way that isn't really working in terms of this war. Doesn't make any great sense. But each step up the escalation escalator pushes us up the further one. So we sent the tanks. The tanks won't work without the aircraft. The aircraft pose all kinds of problems. And, well, where exactly does this all end? In the meantime, the reality is that far from weakening the Russians militarily, it is our stocks of weapons that are becoming depleted. Perhaps, if that deters us from foolish wars in all sorts of other places, that is no bad thing. But it is not what Western governments had in mind when they started this thing. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say today. That's me for today. More from me soon. And in the meantime, we'll see what happens on the Bakhmut and Vuhledar fronts. It does seem as if lots of big events there are coming. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.